That's important.
That is important. Yeah. Thankfully,
I did two podcasts this week where the host forgot to hit record. I
two.
feel so bad. And so we get all the way to the end, you know, and we're like, oh, that was awesome. Yeah, it was awesome. And then like we jump off the call, and then 2 minutes later I get the email in my inbox. Oh my God, I
Oh
forgot to
no!
hit
And
record.
did you have to re-record the entire thing?
Well, yeah, and the worst part is my calendar is kind of busy, right? So you gotta, I can't just give you an hour tomorrow because my day's booked for 2 weeks in advance. So then we have to schedule it
Oh,
out like 3 weeks and do it all over again.
that's
I
painful.
feel bad for the person, right? Because we got all set up, we did the thing, we're all prepped, and then
Oh, that's
it
such
didn't
a
work.
shame. I've got a big post-it note saying record, just like.
Everybody should have that.
Well, thanks for coming along, April. So, for anyone that's not read the book, April is the author of Obviously Awesome: How to Nail Product Positioning So Customers Get It, Buy It, and Love It, and which was our book for Book Club 3 this month. And it's all about how to nail product positioning for your company. So we're going to be having a chat with, we've got Danny just arriving here, let her in. So yeah, we'll be speaking to April, both questions that you've submitted before and any that you've got now about positioning. But April, I'll let you just give a bit of an intro to yourself and tell us why people should care about product positioning in the first place.
Sure. Yeah. So, so my background is I spent 25 years of my career as a vice president of marketing, mainly at a series of startups. I think I did 6 or 7 startups in total. And the reason there's so many is because I would come on as the vice president of marketing and hire a team and get the whole lead to revenue thing going, and then if we were doing our job right, the company would start to grow, and in my case, company would start to grow, everybody get all excited, and then we get acquired, and then you end up at the big company for a couple of years, because usually they make you stick around, or they make it worth your while to stick around for a couple of years, and then I would bounce out and do the whole thing again. And so I did that for 25 years. About 5 years or so ago, I decided to make the switch to consulting. And very specifically, I decided that one of the things that I was uniquely qualified to teach was positioning. And mainly because, that experience of having bounced through a whole bunch of companies in a row, one of the first things you do as a vice president of marketing is you got to make sure that the positioning is really, really tight before you go and spend a lot of money on marketing programs and content creation and lead generation stuff or sales support. You kind of got to nail the positioning first. So I had done an awful lot of that. And not only that, I had a bit of, a methodology for doing it. And so when I was early in my career, it frustrated me that methodology did not exist. And so I felt like I had to make it up. And then as I got further along in my career, it kind of became my specialty. Like if you interviewed me as the VP marketing, I would generally get into this, like, I think you guys have a positioning problem. And by the way, like, I know how to fix it. And you can talk to 1,000 potential vice president of marketing that don't know how to fix that, but I can. And so anyways, when I made the switch to consulting, I started doing just that work. So I don't do anything else. I don't do messaging. I don't do content creation. I don't touch copy. I don't do lead generation or anything else. We just do positioning work. And even more specifically, I just work with tech companies and mainly B2B tech companies. And so, so the book is essentially me writing down my methodology so that people have it. So that was the original idea of the book. Was it would serve a couple of purposes. So one was people that wanted to work with me could read the book and figure out what it was we were going to do together, because I just wrote it down and say, here's what we're going to do. You can either do it yourself, or if you need help, you can come and do it with me. And then it would also be useful to people that didn't want to hire me or couldn't afford to hire me, and they could just go off and do it themselves. So I wrote the book, and here we are.
Yeah, I think that's a really good thing about the book, is that you don't just teach people about positioning, you tell them how they can go about using it in a practical sense and how people can implement it within a company.
Yeah, we talked about this a little bit before we got on, but like there's if you want to learn about positioning, there's this book, and it's funny because I have it on my desk. But there's this book and it's called Positioning: The Battle for Your Mind by these guys Rees and Trout, and it says right on it, the marketing classic. And it is a marketing classic. It's sold like 1 million copies. And if you go to marketing school or anywhere and you want to learn about positioning, this is the book, right? And it is a great book. Like, and I read it when I was starting out in marketing. And what this book does, though, is it gets you really, it explains what positioning is, and it's great at doing that. And it gets you really excited about it. And then it gives you a bunch of examples that these guys have worked on. But what it doesn't do is tell you how to do it. So the idea was you were supposed to read this book, and then you were supposed to call these guys and hire them. And their positioning methodology was the secret sauce. You weren't allowed to know what that was. And so I actually even called them once, and it costs like $400,000 to work with them. And I was working at a crummy little startup, and my entire marketing budget was 30 grand. So I was like, okay, we're not working with these guys. So I had to kind of figure it out on my own. And that made me mad. And it took me a long time to get to something that I thought really worked. And again, like, this is why I end up writing a book like years later, because I thought that book should exist. Somebody should be able to say, here's the book to tell you what it is, but mine's the book that'll tell you how to do it.
Danny's asking, are they mad at you now?
Well, okay, so they're super old. Like, so one thing about this book is it was written in 1982. So, which makes me laugh because, generally when I'm sitting on a call like this, like there's, half the people haven't even been born yet in 1982. And so I think Trout is dead. I think Al Rees is still alive, but he's super retired. But his daughter runs the agency. So her name is Laura Rees, and she's still around. And A, I'm sure they've never heard of me. And B, they're very focused on consumer stuff. So they work mainly with consumer packaged goods companies. So like Coke and Pepsi and Unilever and Procter and Gamble, stuff like that, which is really different from where I focus. Like I'm working with B2B tech companies. So our circles don't overlap much. But I did watch a thing the other day with Laura Rees did an interview online with, and somebody forwarded it on to me. And so yeah, they're still doing that positioning work, but their work is very they're an ad agency. Like that's what they are. So their work is quite focused on consumer, and it's quite focused on the output of their work is ads. Like we're gonna come up with an ad campaign for you, which is pretty different from what I do as well. Like most of my companies that I'm working with, they're B2B. What we're trying to do in the positioning is get clarity and alignment across the team on who do we compete with, how are we different, what's our value, who are we going after, and that's gonna be the foundation for everything we're doing in marketing and sales, not just one ad campaign.
Yeah, absolutely. And
so but I know, like at some point that Laura Rees is going to show up and be like, you
ruined everything.
Who are you?
And so you're focusing on like the B2B tech space for positioning. So what would you say is the most important thing that a B2B company should think of and start when it comes to their positioning?
Yeah, so the biggest mistake I see B2B tech companies make is the first biggest mistake is they don't think about positioning at all. They kind of think it kind of is what it is. And worse, they think that there's no choices. So, the founder wakes up in the morning and says, you know what, I'm going to invent this thing, and it's going to be better email, because email sucks and I want to make better email. And then they build this thing. they put it out in the market and people say, hey, you know, it'd be great if the email was a little more real time, or it'd be great if we did what, you know, if it automatically loaded my contacts off my phone, it'd be great if it did whatever. And so you're changing things, you're adding things, you're removing things. And then you fast forward a couple of years and the market itself has changed, right? So now we have email, we have team collaboration, we have chat, we have all kinds of things that kind of look like email, and you've changed your thing. And so we fast forward a couple of years and all of a sudden, you know, customers looking at your stuff for the first time would be like, is that email really? Or is it chat? Or is it like, what is it? And you, as the inventor, the founder of the company, will say, well, it's email. That's what I built. But is it? Is it? So a lot of the times the companies that come to me, they've built something with a market category in mind, but we're a few years down the road and it just ain't that anymore. So I could give you an example of this. Like I worked with some guys, the examples in the book, but I always point this way when I tell this story because their office is that direction from my house. But these guys, they're mechatronics engineers and they're really into robots. So they found this company and it's robots. So they build these robots. And after a while, they had an idea to build this robot that what it does is it goes in a manufacturing plant and it drives around and it delivers things from one manufacturing line to another, which right now is, you know, most manufacturing plants do that with a person. And the reason they do it with a person, because it turns out it's really hard. Like, so these guys solved this problem with this robot and it drives around and it's full of mapping and sensors and artificial intelligence and it's super sophisticated. So they go to sell this thing to manufacturing plants and they're robot guys making robots, right? So the thing's a robot. So they walk in and they say, hey, manufacturing plant people, I'm here to sell you this robot. And the buyers in the manufacturing plant are like, robots, man, we've been buying robots for decades. And, you know, number one, we have approved robot vendors and you're not on the list. Number two, we're sure our robot vendors have something like what you've got. And your stuff is way too expensive. Why is it so expensive? All the other robots we buy only cost this much. And when they're thinking robot, they're thinking about, you know, a thing that picks up a roll of tape and puts it in a cardboard box. Meanwhile, these guys are coming in with this super sophisticated driving around thing. It's totally different. So they're in the sales meeting going, no, we're not that kind of robot. We're special robots, special robots, unlike any robot you've ever seen before. Right. And so after a while, so again, there's this idea like, what else could we be? We're building robots. Could we be anything else? And so eventually, you know, after suffering through these sales meetings, they said, you know what, maybe we got to stop calling ourselves a robot. Like maybe that's not what we are. So they take this big step back and they're like, okay, you know, what's special about us? Like it's mobility. The thing drives around, it's mapping, sensors, artificial intelligence. Could we position our product in a way such that all that stuff that makes us special is right in the middle of the category we're positioning in, as opposed to they're calling themselves robots and most robots don't drive around. Most robots aren't full of mapping and sensors like some, but so they're like, how could we shift that? And so they went through a few iterations, but what they landed on was maybe what we've built is a self-driving car. And so they started positioning it as autonomous vehicles for industrial uses. And this worked a million times better. So they walk in and say, what we've got is autonomous vehicles. And everybody's like, ooh, of course it drives around. Of course it's got mapping and sensors. Of course it's a little bit more expensive than the thing that picks up a roll of tape and puts it in a box. Of course I'm not going to get that from the same vendors that built me these things that are stationary that just do this. And so that shift in positioning just gave everybody a different context with like a different contextual starting point to understand this thing that they'd never encountered before. Yeah. So long answer to your question, the biggest mistake people make is they're just not positioning deliberately. They're falling into this kind of default positioning, like we're a robot. What else could we be? We're a database. What else could we be? We're email. What else could we be? And the reality is I can take almost any product and position it a dozen different ways. And
It
so,
sounds so simple when it's like the self-driving car compared to, just makes it all just so much easier to.
right.
And
Right, but they didn't set out to build a self-driving car. That wasn't what they were building when they set out. But it's a better way for customers to get an idea of what it is as a starting point, conceptually for customers. Way better way than just saying robot, because robot comes with a bunch of positioning baggage.
yeah. And for people who have, you talk about this a lot in the book, but who have these complex products and it's not landing and they're sort of aware there's a positioning problem probably going on, what advice would you give? Where should they start working out where they should be positioning and what category they should be in?
Right. So, like, one of the things is to understand, like, when you've got something, even if it's not very complex, and you're selling it, particularly something in B2B, right? So you're selling it to businesses. Um, a lot of weak positioning comes from the fact that we don't really understand how the customer makes comparisons. So you come in to sell this thing and you've got an idea of what your competitors are, but your customer is actually looking at a completely different set of things, alternatives to what you do. So the first alternative to what you do is whatever they're doing right now, status quo, right? And what they're doing right now it might not even be software. It might be, I'm going to hire an intern to do this manually, or we've got a bunch of processes and we string it together and we do it like that. In B2B software, we're frequently competing with Excel. Like, oh yeah, we do that. We just do it in a spreadsheet. And so if you're positioning, so I get this one a lot, right? Where company will come to me, little startup, and they'll say, oh, we've got this thing, it's amazing. And I'll say, well, who do you compete with? And they'll say, oh, and they'll give me a list of these dinky little companies nobody's ever heard of, like, 3 guys in a basement in Silicon Valley. Like, here's our competition, big list. And then I'll say, how do you beat those folks? Well, they'll say, ease of use. That's our thing. Like, we make it super easy. If you use those other things, it takes 15 clicks to do a thing. And we do it just 1 click, get it done, ease of use, super efficient. It's great. So you go on their homepage and it's all ease of use by our thing because it's so easy. But then you go to the customer and you say, what would you be doing if these guys didn't exist? What would you be doing? And most of the time, what you hear is something they'll say, oh, I hire an intern to do it. So you're not really competing against this list of other vendors at all. You're competing against the intern. And then the question is, are you easier to use than the intern? No, like that's the one place where the intern's going to beat you. The intern's way easier to use. You just say, give me a coffee, fill out the spreadsheet. Like it's really easy. But the intern sucks at all kinds of stuff. The intern quits on you. The intern can't do advanced math. The intern, doesn't understand a customer's profile and can't react to that. Like there's so many things that software can do that the intern can't. But ease of use is probably not the way you're going to beat the intern. You're going to beat them on a whole bunch of other things. So making the wrong comparison is the first thing that happens, right? Like not looking at it from a customer's perspective and really thinking about what are alternative ways of solving the problem. So the alternative way of solving the problem might be hire an intern, use a spreadsheet. And then when the company does decide to do something different, so that's the first thing you got to beat. You got to beat status quo in the account. Then the second thing is they'll say, okay, well, I can't keep doing this with the intern, like something happens, like the intern quits and you're like, this stinks. I got to get some software for this man because the intern keeps quitting on me. So what do? You do a Google search or whatever, and somehow you make a short list of things to look at. And so the next question is, who ends up on the short list? Not who could end up on the short list, who does end up on the short list? And you got to beat those. So your positioning needs to be kind of rooted in how do I position myself as distinctly different and better than the alternate ways of solving the problem. And the alternate ways of solving the problem, it must be from the customer's perspective and not, anyone that could possibly solve the problem, because I can't position against all 900 of those. So those are the biggest mistakes I see. Like, I'll go into companies and I'll say, who's your competitor? They'll give me this giant long list, but then you ask the head of sales and say, yeah, but who do you really compete with? They'll say Excel, Oracle, that's it. It's like, okay, well then we can focus our positioning on that. How do we beat Excel? How do we beat Oracle? That's it, we're done.
To get that information from the customers about what they would use if you didn't exist, because I think you said in the book, don't actually ask your customers the question directly. Is that how would you approach it if you can't ask?
Yeah, so here's so I've done a lot of these interviews. If you want to get it in an interview, like if you have salespeople, the salespeople know. So and if you're tracking this stuff well in your CRM, the salespeople, generally it's tracked. But here's the two things you want to know. So if I don't have salespeople and I got to go ask customers, then the first thing I'd say is, okay, what were you doing before you used us? That's an easy question. Everyone can answer that, right? What were you doing before you used us? And then, oh, that's interesting. Did it always look like that? Did you evolve to that? Like, how'd you get to that? So what were you doing before you used us? That's the first question. Then the next question is, why'd you decide to stop doing it that way? Like, what happened? What you're looking for is the trigger, right? Was it scale? Was it something happened? Like, you need to understand this as marketers, because I want to have marketing that speaks to you in that moment, that trigger moment when you're like, we can't do it like this anymore. So I need to understand that. And then I need to understand, did you construct a short list? If so, how? For B2B software, generally people do. And so did you ask your friend? Did you Google? Did you go on one of these comparison sites? Did you, and how did you construct a short list? So did you have a list of requirements that you use to filter? Because every market's really crowded. There's, there could be 100 people on there, but you got to narrow it down to 3. How did you narrow it down to a few? And so I'd be looking at that. And then the last question is, out of that short list, you picked us. Why? So these are the things I'd be looking for. But if you have salespeople, this, right? Like the problem with going to ask the customer, right, is if the customer is already using your stuff and they already have the value and they've been using it for a couple of years, and you go in and say, what would you do if we didn't exist? Well, they don't know. They're not in the middle of a purchase process. They don't know what the status quo is. They're not out looking for another thing right now. So they don't know. They do know who they put on the short list when they were looking, and they do know what they were using before. So you can ask them that and get good answers.
Yeah. Just getting those questions that meet them where they were at the purchasing stage.
Yeah, well, that's the problem. Like, I have had some people that read my book and they're like, oh, we just did a survey. We just put the survey out to everyone and said, what would you do if we didn't exist? And, we got this garbage result. Why, April? And I'm like, you can't just go and ask them that. They're not, customers are not experts on solutions, right? They're experts on pain. But they can tell you their purchase process if they've gone through one recently.
Yeah, that's really good points there. I'm just going to jump into some of the questions that people put through before. So this is one from Tom, who is on the call, and this is a question about how narrow is too narrow when you're thinking about positioning versus search volume, for example.
Yeah. So in my experience, and again, this is, if I'm selling stuff to businesses, it's a bit counterintuitive to think that you want to go really narrow. Like, but a lot of founders come to me and they're like, we want to market everything to everybody. That's very common. And they're like, and we'll be a bigger business because that's a bigger addressable market. And we're more likely to close deals because there's just more people in this market. But the marketers know that's not true, right? And the marketers know that targeting, it actually works better the narrower you can go. Like, what you want to do is find, how can I draw a line, a circle around the segment of the market where I always win, or I pretty much always win. And then just market there, and then just go there. I'm not trying to market to everybody, because lots of these places, there's big competitors that I'm never going to win. I just want to find the spot where I'm very likely to win deals. And that's how I get real efficiency in my marketing and sales efforts. I'm just fishing in the spot where the fish are. Now, then you'll get this question of, well, what if it's too small? and I'm positioned around this thing that's too small and there's only one fish there and I need 10. So what are we going to do? And the way to think about it is when you're doing your positioning, you want it to be as well defined as you can, as narrow as you can. Like more specific is always better, but you still need to be able to meet your revenue goals. So, and generally, your short-term revenue goals, not necessarily your long-term revenue goals, because your positioning is going to change. You're not just going to stay here forever. After you've dominated this market, you're going to move the goalposts a little bit and say, okay, now I'm going after this market. Now I'm going after this market. Now I'm going after this market. So for the companies I work with, I'm usually saying, well, look, like how many deals you got to win this year to make your number? And the answer is like 50. We got to win 50 deals to make your number. And then we say, okay, well, we've defined the market where we win right here. How many companies are in there? Is it a few 100,000? If it's a few 100,000, we could probably win 50, right? If it's 1,000, now I'm getting nervous because I don't know if I can win 50 out of 1,000. But if you came and said, oh, there's 200,000, 300,000 companies there, yeah, we could, if we're well positioned in there, we got a real differentiator. It's easy to market to that. That's pretty narrow. And I could probably win a good bunch of them. So I'll give you an example. In the book, I talk about this company that I worked at called Janus Systems. And we narrowed down on investment banks. So we were selling a CRM, enterprise CRM. And at one point we narrowed down to just investment banks. And that made people really nervous because it was like, wait, like how many investment banks are there on the planet? And, our revenue goal for the year was 10 million, I think it was. And it was like, well, can we do, how many deals do we have to do 10 million? Now we were doing really big deals. So it was like, we need to do 20 deals max. So it was like, okay, so we need to do 20 deals and I'm just focused on investment banks. Can I actually do that many? But when we made the list, it actually looked pretty good. There was more than you thought. So there were thousands, not hundreds of thousands, but thousands. We made the list. We got down to the little small ones. There was quite a few. And we had already landed Goldman Sachs and we had Merrill Lynch pretty close. So we're like, we just closed the two biggest ones. So we got a pretty good chance of doing 20 deals in a pool this big. And the way we reasoned it to ourselves was this year, our goal is 20 deals. And yeah, it's not a big market, but once we've done 20 deals in investment banking, we were kind of dominating that space at that point, especially if we've got the top tier ones. So our reasoning was, we'll do that this year and we'll be CRM for investment banking. And then next year, assuming that all goes well, we'll start getting into retail banking. So then we're going to expand it and say we're CRM for banking. Then we're going to go hit some retail banks. Well, there's thousands and thousands of retail banks. So that just made our market a little bigger. So then we'll go to retail banks and we'll probably do that for a little bit. And once we feel like we kind of got we've really established ourselves in retail banking, then we were going to go to insurance and then we would be CRM for financial services. And that's a massive market. Once you throw insurance in there, that's gigantic. And so that's how we sold it to the board is we said, look, this looks really narrow right now, but we're not going to stay here forever. Once we dominate that, then we're going to get a little bigger, then we're going to get a little bigger, then we're going to go get insurance, and then we're going to be a massive company. And then we're going to go be CRM for everybody after that.
That's a nice way to persuade the stakeholders with that argument. It's like
right.
Narrow now, but there's a lot of potential here.
This comes from Jeffrey Moore's book, Crossing the Chasm, which is another oldie book, but a goodie. But in that, he talks about, and it's based on a bunch of research that they did at the time, but he talks about this thing called bowling pin strategy, where you define the lead pin and you knock the lead pin over, and in knocking that over, that helps you get to the next 3 pins. Once you knock those over, then you get the next ones, and then eventually you're strike. That's the idea. And so we spent a lot of time, we were big Jeffrey Moore fans at the time, and we spent a lot of time at the whiteboard drawing the bowling pins and saying, look, lead pin is investment banking, then we're going to this.
Did it go
Yeah.
to plan? Did they become the CRM for everyone following?
Well, so we absolutely do. So what's cool about it is it's a great example of how going narrow helps you get traction faster. So we had been in business for 4 or 5 years trying to be enterprise CRM for everybody. And at the time I joined, we were a little under 2 million revenues. We're a small company. I'm like employee 20 or something. So, we had been going along there for a long time. And then we landed this deal with Goldman Sachs. And the thing about that deal with Goldman Sachs is it helped us realize that the differentiators in our product were really well suited for banking. And so we made the decision to narrow our positioning down and say, we're just going to be CRM for investment banking. And that first year where we narrowed that down, we went from a little under 2 million to almost 80 million in a year, which is pretty fancy for a software company. And so when people talk about like, oh, gee, that sounds so risky and are we going to grow? And we had this spectacular growth after that. And so towards the end of that year, we were starting to sell to other departments inside the banks. We had started talking to retail banks, and we were dipping a toe over in insurance to test it because we were clearly dominating investment banking at that point. And then what happened was we got acquired by the big gorilla in the CRM market at the time called Siebel. But we got acquired for $1.7 billion. Wow. So it was all right. But we grew really fast after we narrowed everything down.
Yeah. Does that answer your question, Tom, about how narrow is too narrow? Did you have any follow-ups to that? Or anybody else, by the way, if you want to chime in with a question.
Yeah.
That was really great, thank you. I think my CEO has actually spoken to April, so we're like super.
Oh, is that true? Who do you work for?
Duro. I think you spoke to Richard not too long ago.
Yeah.
It's just a really interesting issue for us because that kind of how narrow is too narrow feels risky as you're doing it, but it makes so much sense when you think it through.
It feels very risky. Like it's one thing to. Oh man, I'm all echoey. Do you guys hear that echo?
No, sounds fine.
Yeah, it feels really risky. And I'll tell you, even in that company, it's all very well to tell the story afterwards, right? Like, then we made all kinds of money and the ending is happy. But when we were making that decision, it was fraught. Like there were big screaming fights across the executive team where some people were really not on board. It took a long time for us to get agreement internally. Like it was the topic of conversation for 3-4 months. And then when we finally decided, yes, we're going to do it, then we took it to the board and the board was like, no way. Like they were like, we did not invest in you to be some niche little thing. We need you to go out there, and Siebel was our big competitor. We need you to go out there and grind Siebel to dust and whatever. But the reality is we'd been limping along for 5 years and there was never any growth. And so we spent a long time with the board drawing the bowling pins and saying, look, this is not forever. This is just for this year. Then we're going to widen it. Then we're going to widen it. But it felt like a very risky, dangerous move when we did it. So I don't want to downplay that because it's a big decision.
And I think a lot of marketers watching this will be conscious that they want to change their position, go narrow, they're bought in. How would you advise that they begin that journey to get all the stakeholders on board?
Yeah. So that's one thing that I think is super important. Like, as a marketer, you may feel the weakness in the positioning first. But unfortunately, you don't have the ability to unilaterally change it. So, if like most of the time I'd come in, I'd be the brand new vice president of marketing, right? So I show up, brand new VP marketing, and I get looking at all this stuff and I'm like, oh man, the positioning stinks. But I can't just say, oh, hey, by the way, gang, we're not CRM for everyone anymore. We're CRM for banking. Okay. Is that all right? I'm just going to be over here doing that. Like, no, it's like I just changed the whole strategy of the business. Like, so I don't get to make that decision on my own, right? This is an executive team kind of level decision. So instead, what I would do is, and this is very practically what I would do, I would come in, if I thought there was a positioning problem, the first thing I'd do is I go hang out with sales, because if I could open sales's eyes to the fact that, hey, maybe this positioning isn't perfect, then I'm probably right. So I would go, sit around, hang around with sales and sit in on sales calls and be like, God, you ever notice that, you get halfway through this pitch and people still don't really get what we do? Do you ever notice that? Or do you ever notice, like, that guy asked that question, like how we were different from Salesforce and we don't actually compete with Salesforce? Weird, right? Do you get that a lot? And so I would like spend all this time with sales, and usually I would literally spend like a month hanging out with sales and saying, it seems like people don't understand what we do. Would you agree with that? It seems like people compare us to folks that don't really compete with us. Would you agree with that? And then I plant this seed of, I'm not saying the positioning's wrong. I'm saying that maybe we need to look at it. That's it. Maybe we need to look at it. And then if I got sales on board going, yeah, you know what? Yeah, maybe we should. Then I go repeat the process with product, and I repeat the process with customer success if we had customer success. Then I go to the CEO. And I go to the CEO and I say, look, I'm not saying the positioning's bad, but I got a suspicion that maybe we want to visit it. And maybe we'll do the exercise and it'll come out that our positioning's perfect and we can just move along. But I got a suspicion that maybe it's not, and maybe we could tighten it up. And the CEO says, well, did you talk to John in sales? What does he say? And I'm like, call him up. Let's call him. Let's call him. Let's get him on the phone right now. And he calls John in sales, and John says, well, yeah, I've been noticing that, people are kind of confused. Maybe that's a good idea. And then he'd say, well, what does Doug and product think? Well, let's call Doug. Well, I don't know what Doug thinks. Let's get Doug on the line. Doug would say, yeah, maybe we should look at it. So that would be it. So I'd have to get everybody kind of warmed up to the idea. Because if I just ran into the CEO's office on week 3 and said, hey, your baby's ugly, he's going to say, what do you know? You don't know anything about our business. You don't know nothing. You're new in town here. And I can't just say, because I'm the positioning expert, bub. I'm not allowed to say that. So the first thing I got to do is I got to make sure I'm right by hanging out with sales. Then I got to warm everybody up. Then I go to the CEO. And again, I'm not saying we're changing it. I'm saying we're going to look at it. Then you get everybody to the table. Now, once you got everybody to the table, again, you can't just, we can't just walk in and say, okay, what's our value? Why do people buy us? Because that's just going to be a war of opinions. Like, sales is going to say, well, I think they buy us because of this. And the founder is going to say, I think they buy us because of this. It's the smart guy in product is going to say, I think they buy us because of this. And I'm sitting in there going, no, I think it's something else. If all we got's opinions, I like mine the best, right? So we can't have that. So if we get everyone together, we need to have a positioning process that takes the opinions out of it as much as we can. And so that's the methodology that I have captured in the book, but it's this idea like, okay, let's start with something that we kind of objectively can say is true. And so a good starting point is competitive alternatives. So, what's status quo in the account? Who else do we see in the accounts? It just is what it is. And if we have sales team, we know what that is. So we list that down and say, here's what we got to beat. And then we can say, okay, here's what we got to beat. All right, what if we got feature function wise that they don't have? That just is what it is. It's a list of features. So then I say, okay, here's what we got that they don't have. Then I take those features, then I go one by one down that list of differentiating features and say, so what for customers? So what for customers? That's going to get me value. If I can cluster that into 2 or 3 themes, now I got value propositions that are just objectively true. That's my differentiated value. Like, where else does it come from? So it's a bottoms up way of building a value prop that everybody's got to agree with, because it didn't come from my opinions. It's like, look, here's what we got to beat. Here's why we're different. This is the value of that. Then once I have that, then I can say, all right, here's my differentiated value. Who cares a lot about that value? What is it about some companies that make them put a really high price on that value? That's who we need to target. Now, I can't figure that out without knowing the value. I can't figure out the value without knowing the differentiated features. I can't figure out the differentiated features until I understand competitive alternatives. Competitive alternatives, we know what those are. So we start there and we build along. And then we get to market category. Like, basically, I'm saying I got this value, I got these people I'm targeting. What's the best context to position this thing in such that this value is fairly obvious to these folks? That's how you figure out what your best market category is. That's how it works, at least in my methodology. So if I get everybody together in the room, like, first I got to get them together in the room, and then I got to have a process, because if I'm not following a process, it's just going to turn into a fight, and marketing never wins that fight. Ever. In my opinion. I never did. Corner going, okay, yep, what, yeah, okay.
That's such a genius process, from just getting people bought in all the way through to having an objective conversation to lead the positioning.
Yeah.
That's really
so that I tried to capture that in the book. I don't know how well I did, but I tried to capture that in the book. Like, you can't just run out this process on your own, even though people do, like, darn it, like, they read the book and they'll come to me and say, well, I sat in my office and I did your thing. And I'm like, what was step one? Step one was getting the team together, man. You skipped it.
From the beginning. I've seen a question from Remy here. It's, how do you keep everyone in the company, especially sales, focused on the new positioning? All kinds of opportunities come out of nowhere all the time. And how do you keep everyone focused, even if it's just for 1 year?
Yeah, and this is way harder than it looks, right? So the first thing is, by having sales involved in the process to develop the positioning, you're off to a good start, right? So I've got the vice president of sales or the head of sales, maybe a couple of salespeople in the room while we're working through the positioning. The more they understand it, the more likely they are to stick it, right? So we've got them involved in building it so that they buy in, right? And then this is critical in the positioning. It's not that I just have, I love this cat's tail. It's not just that you've got everybody in the room participating. It's that everybody's got to agree. Like, everyone's got to get aligned, and we all got to agree. So I get sales buy-in into it, right? And then the best way I think to get sales consistent on delivering the positioning is we take that positioning and we turn it into a sales pitch. And it's the sales pitch. Like, this is how we're going to pitch. And again, I do that in partnership with sales. So in the workshops that I do with companies where we work on positioning, we work through this whole positioning. And then the last piece that we do at the end is, all right, how do we translate that positioning into a sales narrative? So I'm sitting across from a customer that meets my criteria for good fit. How I tell this story. And so we'll storyboard out the story. And the idea is we'll take that storyboard and then we'll turn that into the actual sales pitch we do in a first meeting with a customer. And so that, that might be a combination of slides plus a demo or whatever, but we'll storyboard it out. And again, we'll get agreement across the whole team. Here's what the story, here's how the story flows. And so then I would usually work with sales. So we'd storyboard it out together as a group. And then me and sales would build the actual pitch. And then we would go and test it together. So I'd go out with sales and we'd do a bunch of test pitches and say, okay, this didn't really work. We need to tune it a little bit until we got a pitch deck, and a deck is usually a deck and a demo that works really well. And then I would take, because I've been testing it with sales, then whoever was with me, if it's the VP or maybe sometimes we just pull the best rep, we go out and test it. And that test would keep going until the rep says, nope, this is good. I like it. I'm not going back to the old pitch. I like this pitch better. We're done. Stop coming on sales calls with me, April. You bug me. And then we would take that rep and have that rep train everybody else. And then, and then you got to keep your eye on it, because, anybody that's worked with the sales team knows that the stuff tends to drift. But if you can work with sales on building the pitch, and then work with sales on testing the pitch until you got something that the head of sales feels really comfortable with, then usually that's a good starting point to get something that isn't all over the place.
Nice. And Remy says, thank you, sage advice.
You're welcome.
And I've got one from Danny, he's down there from Paddle, who's actually who recommended that we read Obviously Awesome for book club.
Oh.
Recommended it to lots of people.
Thank you.
And she asked, where have you seen brands go wrong when it comes to category creation?
Yeah, category creation's like this, it's this hot topic right now. And, and I feel like it comes up every 5 years or so. We have this wave of like, oh my God, we have to create a category. And if we're not creating a category, then our positioning sucks. So first of all, I don't believe that category creation is the best way to position something in the majority of cases. So in the majority of cases, it's much easier to position something within an existing category. But again, you're drawing this circle that says, hey, we're a CRM, but for investment banks, right? So, and the reason why that works better is because everyone knows what a CRM is, and I don't have to, I don't have to tell you what the CRM is. And all I got to do is differentiate myself from the main category and prove that, I'm the best fit for this submarket. We know that works the best because that is the most common form of positioning in successful companies. So I did a little dig through this data a few weeks ago for a thing that I'm writing. But if you look at, I deal with tech companies. So if you look at tech companies that have IPO'd in the last 5 years, and you look at IPO, were they defining a new category, or were they positioning in an existing category? So at IPO, you're like 100 million revenue at least, a lot of them bigger than that, 9 out of 10. So 9 out of 10 are positioning in an existing category versus attempting to create a new one. Even if you look at the 1 out of 10 that is doing something that looks like a brand new category, not all of those have successfully done it. So a lot of them have basically started this category creation exercise. They started out as a niche thing in an existing market. But when they got to like 80, 90 million revenue, then they're attempting to redraw the lines of the market now that they're big. So even if I look at this 1 out of 10, would I say that's the best way to position something if you're brand new and you're at a startup and whatever? No, it's actually pretty rare. The history of Silicon Valley teaches us that what is much more common is companies that attempt to create categories ultimately fail because they get usurped by a fast follower. So this is why we use Google and we don't use Ask Jeeves. This is why we use Facebook and we don't use MySpace, even though those companies, were category creators and they were first in the market and all the rest of it. Generally, one of the biggest risks of category creation is it takes time, effort, money. And by the time you've successfully done it, sometimes it's quite easy for a fast follower to come in and take advantage of all the hard work you've done creating the category and just show up and beat you once it's there. So with that as the preamble, sometimes you are in a situation where there's a confluence of forces happening in the market, and essentially the category is emerging. And if you have data that convinces you that this category is about to emerge, you could attempt to position yourself as the leader in that. So we see that a lot in emerging spaces like there's and I say was because they got bought by Google, but there was a company here locally that was attempting to be the leader in the smart glasses market. And smart glasses market's really interesting because you could argue Google invented that market with Google Glass, but then failed to actually dominate it, at least at a consumer level. Now what we're seeing is this, bunch of consumer plays in the smart glasses market, and it sort of remains to be seen who's going to be the winner there. These folks called North raised a bunch of money, opened some stores, did a really cool product. But in the end, they just got acquired by Google, and I don't know what's happened to them. But, so they took a run at it. So sometimes you've got that. In the book, I've got an example of Eloqua. So founder of Eloqua, he's a friend of mine, Mark Organ, here in Toronto. He identified that, and this is running back lots of years, that there, when he worked with marketers, there was this weird kind of marketer that wasn't doing this branding stuff, and they were weird, like they were working off a spreadsheet and working with numbers, and they called themselves demand gen. And so he had this idea that this was going to become more and more of a thing. The data told him that it was, and he was going to be the software for those folks. And so he invented this thing called demand gen marketing, never existed before. And essentially he bet the company that this thing would emerge, which was Eloqua. And so eventually it emerged, and it emerged so hard that it kind of usurped marketing all across, and it became everything we were doing in marketing was demand gen if we were B2B. And so he changed the name. So he started out calling it demand gen automation, and then he changed it to be marketing automation. And that's where marketing automation comes from. So he invented that category, and, and they successfully lived to dominate that category. So, so I think that worked out pretty well for everybody. It took a long time, more than a decade, but he did that. So sometimes, there is no good market category for you to position in, like, for his stuff. What else could it have been? Like it kind of was its own thing. So you got to do this category creation thing. But generally you don't actually want to do that unless it's kind of your last choice, because it is the hardest thing to do. I don't know if that answers the question, but it's my speech on category creation. Like right now, there's like these guys going around. There's some guys that they wrote a book, and I heard about it because they came and did a talk at the incubator in Toronto. And they showed up, and they're like, look, we're the smart guys from Silicon Valley, and here we're going to tell you what's what. And if you're not creating a category, you're stupid and you're never going to win. And then they gave all the examples of companies that were category creators. And so one of the examples they gave was Salesforce. And I was like, boy, people have really short memories, because, let the old lady here that was there at the time tell you how they positioned when they came out. And I know because I worked at their competitor. So when Salesforce up to like 200 million revenue was a niche play in the CRM space. Like there was a 2 billion revenue company in CRM. I know because I worked there. Like they didn't invent CRM. They were a niche play in CRM. They were CRM for small businesses. Their differentiating feature was you didn't need an IT department to set it up because it was SaaS, no software. That's where it came from. And these guys are writing this book saying everybody's got to be a category creator, and look at Salesforce. They're so successful. And I'm like, dude, you just ignored the first 5 years of that company's existence. Like now, yeah, sure. Once you're $1 billion revenue, it's pretty easy to say, here's what we're doing now, and we're going to move the goalpost now, and that's different. But I think for startups, if you're new and you're doing something brand new, it's really hard to create a category. And there are not very many examples out there of companies that successfully did it and then lived to reap the rewards of that successful category creation.
That answers your question, Danny.
In a terrifying way, because we are obviously, now I'm going to admit to one of the ones who have recently done a repositioning project, which is looking to go down that route, but with the pockets to match, I'm hoping, and the no shy of understanding of how hard it's going to be.
Well, I think that's it. Like, I think if you run into it with that, like, I'll tell you, I've done maybe 150 positioning workshops with companies over the last 3-4 years. And I went back and tried to count up how many of them did we end up like, nope, you got to create a category for this because there's no other way to do it. And there's a bunch of them, like 7 or 8 of them. And so it's not like we never do it, but then, but we do it like this.
That's my sense. So I think ours came out of working with a consultancy called Firebrick. And yeah, it's ambitious, but here's hoping that it's not following the trend, and it actually kind of will be. But yeah, in terms of taking that forward, I guess it's just going to be working hard and hoping.
And is it really new category? Like sometimes people come to me and they'll say, we're creating a whole new category. Like I had one the other day. They're like, we're creating a whole new category. It's totally doesn't exist before. And it's a new category. And I'm like, oh yeah, what is it? And they're like, we're social media management for agencies. And I'm like, no, you're a niche in the social media management space. But the way they saw it was this, because they were carving off this subsegment, and there was no other, in their opinion, no other company that was going after the subsegment, that was category creation. And I was like, okay, if you define it like that, then I don't define that as category creation. And I think that's fine. And I think that's good positioning and easy to do. So sometimes people come to me and they say they're doing a category creation thing, but I kind of disagree that it's category creation. And I think that's good because it means it's going to be easier.
Yeah, that's true.
Like the example I gave about the guys who repositioned themselves as self-driving cars for manufacturing is an interesting example of that, right? Because there were no other autonomous vehicles for industrial uses. That didn't exist before. And so you could argue that they're making they're creating a new category, but they're not. What they're actually doing is stealing what we know about self-driving cars and positioning themselves in the self-driving car market. Right. So it's not like you're walking up and saying, hey, we got this great thing. It's a flue-flummer. And you're like, the frick's a flue-flummer? And you're like, glad you asked. Let me tell you. And like true category creation is a bit like that. Right? It's a bit like walking in and saying, like I've got some guys, and again, I'm pointing at everybody's office. There's a company called Uberflip here in Toronto, and they're in the middle of creating a category called content experience. And content experience is a bit like flue-flummer, right? Because it's like, what is that? I have no idea what that is. They've been at it for 2 years. I still don't know what it is, right? And so that's category creation because that's a thing. It doesn't exist. No one knows what it is. And every time they have a sales meeting, they have to start by explaining what content experience is and why they're the right folks to deliver on that.
Where I do have some hope with what you're saying and the fact that we are pursuing this positioning is that we're naming something that already exists but doesn't have a name. So people quickly understand what we're talking about when we go in and say, this is what we do. And there is very quickly that aha moment. But it's currently, the current status quo is typically a piecemeal solution where we're a kind of all-in-one and expansion of. So I'm hoping that we
perfect. And that I think these I think are the ones where it deserves a category, right? Because essentially what we're saying is, like, we're not making up a new thing, right? The category has emerged, is emerging, and we're essentially going to be the solution for that. The Eloqua is a perfect example of that, as opposed to what you've got going on with, like, everybody talks about drift, right? So drift has this thing, and it's called
conversational marketing.
No, they dumped that. They got a new one. Revenue acceleration.
Yeah.
And so we're a platform for revenue acceleration. And they just made that up, right? What they are is chat. But we don't want to say we're chat. We want to say we're something else. So we're going to call it this. And does that work? I don't know, right? I don't know. Now, if there was ever a company with the funding to take a run at it, it's them, right? And I also think that in some ways, you know, they're saying it's a category, but what I actually think it is an expression of the value that you get out of their software, right? Like, why do you want chat for sales and marketing? You know, you want to do it because it's going to accelerate your revenue. So I'm not even sure about that one. I puzzle on it whenever it comes up, but yeah. So I think people are very confused about category stuff right now.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but we're at time, and I just realized it.
Yes, we are. That was
Right.
like brilliant. Thank you so much, April, for all your nuggets of wisdom there.
No problem.
Yeah, lots of thank yous coming through in the chat there, and a lot of what April covered you can read. Anyone watching the recording, loads of what she's covered is in her book. Obviously, awesome. Yeah. Perfect. Have a good. It's morning for you, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it's noon,
Noon.
so we're just past, yeah.
And
But it's getting late for you folks.
it's like 5 p.m. in the UK.
All right, well, thanks so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, have a great day.